Welcome back, viewers. For those of you who are just joining us, I am with Miss Amanda Mukwashi. She is the Chief Volunteer Knowledge and Innovation Sector at the UNV, United Nations Volunteer. Now, going into our second segment, we were talking about the Harambee spirit, and there's the Ubuntu, the South African one, yeah? And majority of Kenyans and also Africans are located in rural areas. How have they received this? In essence, if they have at all embraced volunteerism?
I think that they have, to say they have embraced it is to almost suggest that it is new to them. It is not new to them.
Yeah.
Now, the wording that we use, volunteerism, might be new because it's a new word.
Yeah.
But if we break it down and go to the people in the remote areas, in the rural areas, and talk about this spirit of Harambee, they are probably more likely to tell us more about it than ourselves.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Because this is this has been the backbone of most communities, right? If you look at it in cases of conflict, for example, who are the first people who are there to support, to help? It's the people from the communities themselves, the rural areas.
Yeah.
If you look at disasters, whether it's an earthquake in Nepal, whether it's an earthquake in Japan, you look at the documentation, it tells you that the first people on the scene are the members of the communities themselves. However, what we see, and what this report suggests, is that the majority of volunteering happens in the informal way. So in the rural areas, in the communities, what we see as formal volunteering, which happens in formal organizations, is, I can't give percentages, but is not the majority of volunteering. And so what we need to do, and what the report is suggesting, is that especially in rural areas, where we know that volunteering is not a level playing field. Yeah. Not everybody has got the opportunity to actually get into those decision-making spaces in rural areas or even in other communities. The social norms might suggest that, for example, a woman must be quiet, right? What we need now is policies and legislation that allow women to go into those spaces, even in the villages, and speak, and be allowed to speak their mind and be heard. Yes, and be heard. Because I think, personally, I see that over the next so many years, we have to move from just listening to actually hearing and responding. And that is what the report is suggesting. Moving from voice and participation to responsive institutions. And here I want to emphasize something, Linda. It's not just about governments. It's also about civil society organizations. Yeah. Because civil society organizations also work with volunteers. How are they held accountable? What is this mutual accountability with volunteers? How do they respond, especially to informal volunteering? I think it's easier to provide for formal volunteers. You can provide support, for example, funding support for them to get to their volunteering activities. But in the informal area, that is not there. Without funding, without support, then it's very difficult. For young people, for people who are disabled. Sometimes the volunteering opportunity is there, but really, is it really there if I'm disabled and I can't get to the activity? And so in the rural areas, I believe that it's already there. And what we need to do is to nurture it, to open it up so that it can be accessed by everybody. We don't want to over-legislate. That's true. Because that would kill the spirit in which people do it.
Yeah, that's wonderful. Now, you've talked about leveling the playing field, and that was also mentioned in the report. So what is the UNV doing to level the playing field for volunteers?
What we are doing with UNV, we support member states through, of course, the UN agencies that work on the ground. UNV is part of UNDP. And we support member states to look at what kind of what we call volunteer infrastructure, which is the legislation, the policies, the volunteer schemes. How can they set those up? And we are there to provide support as much as we can to different governments in different countries.
Okay.
We have, of course, a volunteer program ourselves, and which we have over 6,000 volunteers who support peacekeeping missions, but they also support development activities across different countries through UN agencies, whether it's UNICEF, whether it's WFP, whether it's UNDP. And about 80% of our volunteers are actually from the global south.
All right.
They're from developing countries.
Yeah.
And we also have, we keep an eye on the gender balance as well, because it's important for us for women to equally have the opportunities to volunteer. So about, I think, over 60% are women, if my statistics are accurate.
All right, wonderful.
Yes.
So you've talked about CSO, civil society organizations, and that they work hand in hand with the volunteers. Now, I want to highlight a situation in Africa at the moment. In Burundi, we have a lot of unrest going on there. How maybe can volunteers be assured of their safety and CSOs alike, given that there's a partnership there?
Perhaps I can't necessarily talk about the specific situation in Burundi because I have not yet been there, and also it's sort of outside. I mean, the current situation is outside the scope of the report. However, what we have seen is that in times of conflict, in times of peace building, volunteers partner with the governments, they partner with civil society organizations. If you look at the National Red Cross, and if you look at quite a number of other civil society organizations, they partner with them to immediately engage in peace building activities. They are there, UN volunteers, for example, are there in peacekeeping missions, but they're also there post-conflict. They're there in rebuilding. They contribute with not just civil society organizations, but also with the communities themselves, because that's the only way that it can be sustainable. Now, you asked me specifically the question of their safety and their protection. And this is an issue that is also taking it's taking our time in terms of thinking about how can that be done both for international volunteers as well as for local community volunteers. Now there is the World Humanitarian Summit, I think, that is going to take place next year. And it is our hope that based on more evidence, if we invest a bit more in research, in coming up with factual evidence that we can then present to the World Humanitarian Summit in terms of the situation of safety and protection of volunteers, then perhaps we can raise awareness of the issues and the critical policy areas that might be required.
All right, therefore guaranteeing the safety. Now, former Ghanaian President Rawlings yesterday gave a very passionate speech, and one of the areas that I felt that he really touched on was the lack of the spirit of togetherness. He highlighted the Ghanaian floods and the fire that was there, and how everybody assumed the government would be the one doing the cleanup. And there's that lack of togetherness in our African continent. How can we solve this? And is volunteerism, the spirit behind it, the answer?
I think he did. Yes, it was a very passionate speech, and I loved it. I think that what he sort of touched on was the pulse of the changing nature of our communities. And whereas there are advantages in terms of some of the progress that we're experiencing, when you look at globalization, when you look at technology, when you look at the dynamism that education has brought, one of the things that I think we might have been in danger of losing is that transition from what used to be very close-knit communities to what is now quite dispersed communities. Now, I'm very privileged in that I lived at the village once in Zambia, and then I lived in the city in Lusaka, and then I moved and became part of the diasporan communities. So I have lived 3 lives, if you can. And I remember the coming together of communities at the village, where we helped very much, not just your relatives, but outside of your relatives, to make sure that we supported each other, whether it's in plowing season, harvesting season, funeral times, celebrations, we did that. And then you move into town, and that already, because of the geography and the location, it is no longer much, as easy as that. Yeah. And how can we begin to address that and bring that back? Yeah. I think that if you look at the case of Kenya post the 28 post-election violence, yeah. You look at the case of Ushahidi, that case study. Yeah. Already you can see the bringing together of communities through technology, right? So now it's not just the communities in terms of physical vicinity, it's also in terms of technology. You can see that young people are touching each other, they're reaching out.
Yeah, no
to
matter where you are.
Exactly. Yeah. And I think that we can, I don't want to say all is lost, because I don't think it is. I think it's manifesting itself differently. Right? Now, what we need to do is we see it also from the local to the national and global. Look, if you look to the People's Climate March that took place in New York, it wasn't just in New York. There were marches, I think over 2,500 marches across the world in over 162 countries, right? That was reaching out to a global community that was informed by local experiences. That's true. Right? That's true. And so I think that we have to grapple with the new virtual community and then see how that relates to the physical community, because it cannot replace the physical community, which is still important. So maybe I don't have the answers for that, but what I think is that the time is right. The global community is now looking at a new set of global development agendas and global goals. And the solution for that is not going to be only in economic solutions, it's going to be also a social solution. And I think volunteering can add some value to that. Yeah.
Wonderful. Yeah. Ladies and gentlemen, a very insightful discussion we're having with Ms. Amanda Mukwashi. We're taking a short break. Keep it Point of View on TVC.